question. As far as I know, we use the NDC submitted to the UNFCCC. So I would have to maybe talk further with you about where the second one exists, or if it has an official status like the one that we used. But I would like to talk about that actually. In terms of other commodities, yes, of course there are a range of commodities produced in all these countries, including Indonesia. For this report, we wanted to focus on the commodities with the largest impact in terms of scale of production and impact on forestry. But in terms of how other commodities fit into the picture, some of the initiatives I highlighted, some of the literature describing them does elaborate on the fact that although they're starting with a focus on maybe one commodity to get the framework in place, the hope is that eventually they'll be able to integrate other commodities into the systems that they're creating and the architecture for collaboration and for monitoring. So I think there is potential for these initiatives to be focused on a range of agricultural commodity production kind of scopes.
I think you mentioned smallholder farmers as well. And, you know, in the case studies I highlighted, smallholders were a large part of their initiative, especially the Mato Grosso's Produce, Conserve, Include strategy has a specific pillar around including smallholders, providing technical assistance to them, and making sure that they have access to markets. They also, a lot of these initiatives work very closely with the producer associations, and they have a really big role in shaping the initiatives. And this goes also for the soy moratorium. So I think they also play a really important role.
Thank you. The next question, if you could introduce yourself as well before.
Yes. Hello, my name is Cecile Schneider. I work for Conservation International Europe, and I actually work on a topic that is very related to this, which is called the imported deforestation to the EU. So basically the imported agricultural commodities that you're referring to, they end up ultimately on the plates of European consumers, especially when it comes to palm oil, soy, but also many others, cocoa, coffee. And so basically my question would be, do you also see a link between, so you mentioned some of these companies like Unilever, it's a European companies. So would there also be scope to link a private sector commitment from a European companies to the European NDC in terms of imported deforestation? I mean, I know that imported deforestation is not currently in the European NDC. However, there are discussions about an EU action plan on deforestation and forest degradation that would actually, in my opinion, contribute to the global goal that we're reaching, especially in the light of, I was just in the side event before, so the long-term strategies to reach 1.5 degrees, they were saying that in order to reach that, we would need to reduce the emissions from deforestation up to 95% by 2040. So basically, we really need to stop deforestation. And I think it's a bit easy to say that all the responsibility is on the producing countries and on their NDCs. And so, yeah, whoever companies can afford it, they help them. So that's great. But for us, it should really be kind of more generalized and kind of a legal requirement, even from the importing countries, to say, okay, we only import agricultural commodities that are free of deforestation, free of forest degradation, and free of human rights abuses. Mm-hmm. So that's an ask that we have towards the EU. But so, yeah, just my question would be, how is there a scope to link that also to the European NDC, do you think? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for those insights. Certainly consumer countries have a role to play in this equation. And as many of you know, consumer country pressure has led to a lot of these corporate commitments in the first place by Unilever and others. In terms of linking it to European country NDCs, I haven't really thought about that. It's a novel idea. It could be interesting. I think it may be difficult to work out exactly maybe how to measure that, but I certainly agree that governments of countries that are importing these products need to be more involved. And in fact, to some extent, our research has shown they're funding a lot of they're injecting a lot of the funding that's enabling these initiatives to come together. And I didn't go into the detail on a lot of that just for the sake of time. But European donors are playing a role in supporting these initiatives. And I think any kind of policy regime that could better integrate kind of incentives from the European side would be welcome. And there's a lot of ways that could look. I mean, you could look to the forest sector, and flag tea is one kind of potential example. I think that's similar to what you're talking about, you're pushing for. So there's a lot of ways that could be considered, I think.
Yeah, some of our interviewees also mentioned this role of importing countries, especially people we talked to in Mato Grosso's Produce, Conserve, Include strategy mentioned that importing countries should also look at certain jurisdictions who are working towards zero deforestation to import commodities from those jurisdictions, and also to support them in creating their government institutions and their incentives programs, creating strong state and national REDD+ programs, which kind of help them build this governance to have a kind of a zero deforestation jurisdiction that could serve as a supply shed for companies.
So I'd like to get on this a little bit. Two observations on that comment. One, a number of years ago, we tried in Substa to get a driver's conversation, and that ended up pretty much nowhere because of trade issues from concerns listed by at least one of the countries on this presented in this deck. So, something to push, but I think at least, again, in the framework of the NDCs and CCC, it'd be difficult because again, countries flag the trade component to it. Second, I'm glad you brought up let's say industrialized countries, because I think the two cases we have here, of course, are, you might say, emerging and then tropical forest countries, but we do think there is a role for industrialized countries also to be more specific in their NDCs and how they're going to work with the private sector, specifically in the land use sector. So it's not just tropical forest countries that need to, let's say, be a little more articulate in it, but also industrialized emerging countries also. I like to say I see a lot of red badges, pink badges in here too, and I would be interested to hear some experiences that maybe you've had in trying to put together your NDCs, if you have any, from any of the country delegates that are here, and trying to work with the private sector to get a better understanding of what they're doing and how it fits into an NDC. Thanks.
Next question.
Okay. Suchitra Chantakun from Department National Park, Thailand. Thank you for the interesting presentation. First question I'd like to pose to the first presentation on Brazil, that the soybean moratorium, 30% to 1 is to deforestation. I want to know what kind of the strategy option to reduce that, to maintain the production at the same, or they reduce the production of that. And the second one, to Indonesia, you have the suggestion that government should provide incentive to the private sector. And I wonder what kind of the involvement of the previous one that already done. This means that they have no incentive at all, and how they involve on this activity. Yeah, I would like to know on that. And wonder for this effort whether it could be effect for the price of the product or not in the future. Thank you.
So for the soy moratorium, I think one of the largest drivers for this large change in kind of making soy less of a driver of deforestation is that companies kind of use a disincentive of restricting producers that have deforestation from selling commodities. And because the soy companies that made this pledge control such a large amount of the soy trade in the Brazilian Amazon, about 90% of soy trade, they were able to really have this influence because soy traders didn't have many other companies to buy from. The Brazil government also played a really large role in this drop in deforestation. They were at the same time going after producers that deforested and putting them on embargoed lists and making sure that all the producers in the region knew that if they deforested, they would have these penalties. And as for incentives, I know, I think a lot in Brazil so far has been on negative incentives, kind of using the forest code and penalizing farmers that have deforestation. So now, and especially since recently in Brazil, we've seen kind of an uptick in deforestation in the last 2 years. A lot of people are saying now that there should be some sort of positive incentives as well, especially through the Red Plus program, that there should be payments for ecosystem services to producers. And there are also a lot of these incentives have been built into Brazil's laws, like in the forest code and in the low carbon agriculture program to provide like loans and other incentives, but in many cases they haven't been operationalized. So in some cases these incentives do exist, they just haven't been realized yet.
Yeah, and in terms of incentives in the Indonesian context, I would say that there's kind of two ways to think about it. Incentives can be positive and negative, and I think both can be important. So on the positive side, there's a lot of room for regulatory incentives, maybe related to permitting, or for instance, if a company can demonstrate that they've achieved third-party sustainable certification standard for their production, the government could offer some sort of permitting advantage or regulatory advantage or a tax break or something that really gets at the bottom line business kind of benefit to these companies for achieving higher standards. And yes, definitely buyer countries and governments at the sort of purchasing side should also be involved in these incentives, I think. And that could be through price premiums. And then on the negative side, I think incentives can be in the form of better enforcement of existing laws. So in the case of Indonesia, there's the moratorium on primary forest clearing, on peatland conversion, and now more recently on the issuing of new permits for palm oil concessions. I think those are all really helpful regulatory incentives. The question just becomes, are they adequately enforced at the grassroots level? And if they are, I think that provides more of a level playing field for companies that want to do the right thing and to act more responsibly, because they won't be undercut as easily by companies willing to cut corners at an environmental cost, but then produce their product for less money. So I hope that answers your question.
Sorry, I wanted to add one more thing on the soy moratorium. We didn't have time to cover it in our report, but there's also a lot of ways that people are looking to expand the soy moratorium. So again, it's not exactly that everything is perfect. And so a lot of NGOs and government and the Brazilian government and these companies are looking for ways to expand the soy moratorium to the Cerrado region, so there's not leakage into that, into those grasslands areas, and to include indirect suppliers and also other commodities, since you could still deforest for cattle or other commodities. So it has made a lot of gains, but there's still room for it to improve.
Suchicha, great. Thanks for the questions. Just to kind of some macro level observations. One, I think what we've seen and we'd like to see more in the NDCs are specific incentives. I think Brazil talks about how it wants to expand its loans or subsidized loans for agriculture intensification. Those are the types of things we'd like to see rather than price premiums. We don't think the 4 billion consumers like in the emerging markets are going to be able to pay a price premium for deforestation-free something. They're just, that kind of market pull is not going to be available. We need to look at how do we basically raise the standards or bar and enforcement and to ensure that, again, the deforestation is just not in these commodities. So thanks.
Thank you. I think we have a question at the back.
Yeah, hello. My name is Trevor. I'm from the Rainforest Foundation, Norway. I'm glad to see that the conversation now is qualifying the somewhat very positive picture that was painted at the beginning. That's good. And that's also what I wanted to contribute with. Because as you now started to mention, one of the things that happened with the soy moratorium in the Amazon was that the emission and deforestation was kind of displaced over in, for example, the Cerrado, which is also a high carbon value and high biodiversity value area. And it seems now also that deforestation is returning to the Amazon. So even though such a moratorium and effect has been good for a while, it also highlights the difficulties of a subnational approach that you easily displace the deforestation or the emissions, and that is something that needs to be considered. And I also wanted to comment that you mentioned the certification and the RSPO. From our perspective, the RSPO certification doesn't go far enough in ensuring that the products don't originate from deforested lands. It doesn't exclude deforestation of secondary forests, for example, which is huge problems. And the most progressive companies are now moving to other more comprehensive certification, such as the POI, palm oil something. I don't remember the. Yeah, which is something we recommend that more companies do. Another thing that the private sector could do, since that's something you ask, is I guess respect the moratorium. Indonesia has had a moratorium in place for many years that hasn't been respected by companies, so that's something that should be done. And you can easily point to lack of implementation and enforcement from the government, but it doesn't exonerate private businesses from responsibility. It has been in place for some time, and it needs to be respected. Yeah, so that's some comments from my side. I had a few other. Yeah, I should leave it at that. But it's important that this picture is somewhat, or it needs to be qualified, because it also the first comment that you received that that there was a lack of involvement of civil society in these case studies. It's also really important that there needs to be this picture of what is actually achieved, even though some good things seem to have happened, needs to be qualified by other actors on the ground who can have a up-close look on what has actually happened.
All right, so I'd like to clarify. Can you go back to the first slide of this whole presentation? We are not making judgments on the quality and how effective RSPO is, the soy moratorium, et cetera. We're just pointing out one peer-reviewed study. We have a mandate from our donors, which were IUCN and NWF, to study how can private sector initiatives help scale NDCs and how can they play together. Okay, that's the question we're trying to answer. Again, we're not trying to make pass judgment on is the soy moratorium functioning, has RSPO, stakeholder consultations, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so if you want to add those qualifiers in, please do, but we're trying to focus on, again, how do private sector initiatives and NDCs try to work together, okay? And that's where I think my colleagues here that did the research was pointing out were the aspects of these different private sector initiatives and government initiatives that overlap with the key points in the NDCs that these countries have submitted, again, to reduce deforestation. Okay? Thanks.
We do in the report go over especially ways that these initiatives can improve. A lot of those are from our interviews with civil society, especially, and I think we did have a mandate to kind of focus on what the private sector was doing and what they had committed to, but many of these case studies were either led by civil society or they played a really large role. And some of the things that the civil society especially pointed out was that the private sector engagement was important for getting attention to this issue particularly from the governments too, to show that this isn't just an environmental issue. This is this is important for our economy, for these large companies within their countries. But back on each individual initiative, we didn't want to go into like looking at every single like zero deforestation commitment and what the definitions are and what they should be, because there's a lot of papers on that right now. And we wanted to really focus on what companies are actually doing right now and like the actions that they're putting in place. So a lot of these programs could be strengthened first by making sure that they have a strong definition of deforestation. It's really the foundation of the initiative. But we wanted to focus on, what they're doing, and which, especially if they can be strengthened, can really help implement these NDCs. And Natalie wrote a paper on soy moratorium. And
yeah, just to say on that point about leakage, people have assumed that, but actually production of soy in the Amazon increased more than 200%, partly from double cropping and displacing cattle. So it's and the paper just came out last week showing increased effectiveness than previous studies about the soy moratorium. So I think it's easy to look at. It's important to really understand what happened, and these initiatives have definitely changed what's happening. Of course, everything can always be improved. And of course, civil society led the creation of the soy moratorium. So just to speak to that. We'll have a couple more questions, and we'd like to lead into some guided group discussions for the room. So should we?
I'll start here and then
Start.
you three.
Good afternoon. My name is Ümit Urhan from Turkey, state side. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Very nice. And I'm curious about forest ownership of your countries, Mexico, Brazil, and Indonesia. What are the pros and secondly, what are the pros and cons as a private and public ownership of the forest to achieve the deforestation commitments, public or private sector? Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is about tenure over land and forest in Indonesia, if I understand correctly. Our study doesn't go into that very deeply at all, but I would just say that tenure is obviously a very important issue for a range of reasons, including the effectiveness in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from these initiatives. The Indonesian NDC does specifically mention the importance of tenure security for the achievement of the NDC. Doesn't go into a lot of detail on what that looks like. One thing that Indonesia has been doing for the past several years is what's called the One Map initiative. So the government has been trying to align the different mapping systems across all the agencies to try to make one coherent, universally agreed upon map that the government can use for planning and decision making. And that's a hugely important endeavor. And I think that needs to be concluded. And that would definitely kind of address some of the outstanding questions about tenure in the country. So I guess I would just point to that as one important initiative going on in Indonesia related to tenure.
Sorry, if I may, I have a different question to my first one. So just taking advantage that your presentation left some time for questions.
Oh, it's okay. I think, sorry, Cecile, but I think there were other questions from people back behind that haven't been able to ask a question yet. So
Okay.
I'm really sorry.
Okay.
Was there?
If we have time, we'll come back to you though, for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Karina Perez. I work for the Forest Stewardship Council. And my question is, how did you address the complexity of the definition of zero deforestation as such in your study? And to which extent you think it represents a barrier for alignment with the NDCs?
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. As Dana sort of hinted at, that's a direction we didn't want to go down very deeply in our study, because it's a fairly brief study. We wanted to focus on the core issues, and there is quite a range of kind of perspectives and criteria that are used by companies and governments when talking about zero deforestation, zero net deforestation, zero gross deforestation,
Exactly.
all these sorts of things. So we sort of didn't get into the distinctions between all those, but just talked about the fact that there are these commitments to reduce deforestation in whatever specific way you want to measure or talk about that. But there is enough similarity, despite the differences, that we can sort of talk about them in a coherent way. I'd be curious to hear from others the extent to which they think that diversity hinders collaboration and progress. I'm not entirely sure myself, but that's an interesting question.
Yeah. Well, I guess one way we did that kind of emerged from our studies was certain of these more jurisdictional approaches, like in Mato Grosso and Central Kalimantan, did provide at least common goals for a multi-stakeholder group. And yes, there's a lot of ways to increase the ambition, and sometimes those zero deforestation commitments need to be further defined and made more ambitious. But it is a way to make sure that from the local level, especially, like having both governors heavily involved in these initiatives, that they have a role in setting those goals and definitions and agreeing on with them with the companies. So I think that is one way that they can become more aligned.
It's interesting. A lot of the NDCs have different definitions. Brazil's is really interesting, where they have zero illegal deforestation. Yeah. You're like, okay, by 2030, you're going to be legal. But then you saw in companies have zero legal deforestation, zero deforestation, which is legal. So, right, it's not clear. And I think that's what's interesting is I understand that Brazil is doing more consultations right now around this, and how governments are going to be talking to Brazil, to the government, federal government, not just the jurisdictional level around this, I think is very important. And in my understanding, it's a very hot topic. I mean, the other thing that's interesting with NDCs is there's you have the two in Indonesia, for example, where it's what we'll do on our own and then what we'll do supported. I mean, does supported mean bilateral ODA money coming from a donor government, or could it be also the 1 million hectare restoration commitment by APP? I mean, so there's a lot of different things here that needs to be teased out better, and I think more conversations in the platforms are important to have that. But we need to help. There needs to be more detail in the NDCs, and that's why it's important here right now too. We're having these conversations about what should be in your NDC, that we get more detail so we can do the accounting and hopefully then ratchet up again more ambition. Thanks.
We'll take one more, and then we'd like to move to some guided questions for the audience, and then see if we have, because we're running out of time. And I should say there are refreshments afterwards, so we want to make sure that we finish on time and we can continue the conversation outside. So for one last question at the back.
Can I?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Maureen Santos. I'm from Brazil, from Haishibou Foundation. I think it's the same topic, and it's important to highlight about that in this new forest code, they approve this category that's a legal deforestation. So it's very important to take this account when you make this study, because this legal deforestation, as you can deforest, you still deforest in some areas of your property, and you can compensate in the same biome. But you have all the debate about the same biome doesn't mean that the same ecosystem, doesn't mean that the biological structure is the same thing. So I think it's a very important point that you have to figure it out. Other issue is about the Cerrado biome, because when you talk about the soybean moratorium, it's all about Amazon. And all the outcomes and externalities that have passed after this was very important to highlight, especially the livestock increasing in the Amazon region, and that caused the increase of deforestation in this area, and also the deforestation in the Cerrado biome with the increase of soybean that didn't have the moratorium. So we have already 70% of the Cerrado biome that's deforested right now. So when you talk about this pledge and the deforestation-free pledge for the private sector, is very, very important to talk about what's going on right now with the expansion of the soybeans in the Cerrado biome, not only in the Amazon. Thank you.
So yes, we're just going to have one last question, and then we'll move to...
Thanks. It's actually related, because I'm from Jeff Skier from the International Renewable Energy Agency, and we had understood that the reduced rate of deforestation was in fact due in large part to more sustainable intensification of livestock raising in the Cerrado. And so I'm wondering if you have assessed, or is there a current view on the remaining available land that could be freed up through sustainable intensification of pasture land and or farmland, and have you considered what policy mix might be able to speed that up?
Great. Yeah, if I can answer, just because I'm aware there was a report out a few months ago by a Brazilian agricultural consultancy called Agroecony, and they worked with the person who monitors a soy moratorium to look at available cleared land, and they found in the Cerrado there's 25 million hectares of land already cleared that's suitable for soy production. A lot of it contains pasture, a lot of that's degraded, doesn't actually have cattle. So in terms of the cost to be able to intensify in order to convert the necessary out of the 25 million hectares of land, I think they predict about 12 million are needed for expansion according to Brazil's projected needs for the next sort of 30 years. And so there's more than enough available land. It's just the right incentives have to be in place to be able to intensify the cattle. And as was mentioned, it's something that the government's trying to achieve, and the government research agency has very well-established methods for doing this. So in terms of the economics, I don't think anyone's completely sure, but there's an area of hot sort of research. But definitely in terms of available land and what's possible, it's certainly possible for Brazil to meet its needs for agriculture without conversion. And there's been a number of studies on that in Brazil. So with that, we'd like to move to some guided questions. And the first one is just to continue, I think, something that Chris brought up, but we'd really love to hear from parties if they have views about how the private sector and civil society representatives have been incorporated into either the creation or implementation of NDCs and any other complementary policies.
Is there anybody from government here who worked on their NDC? Raise your hand. Come on. Nope. Okay. Well, that's a hard one. Can't answer that.
Okay. So we'll save time for more general questions. So then the second question would be, what are the best examples in your country of governments, companies, and civil society collaborating on NDC goals and corporate commitments? Anyone would like to present some additional examples from other countries?
All right, I know there's some criticisms of their current initiatives people are doing. Does anybody have a shout out that they think is a good one that they'd like to point out? Rainforest Foundation Norway? We don't have any ideas as to how to make things better? Just come on. There's got to be something out there. Who's got an example?
We also recognize that this is a little bit less traditional than the other side events, but
This is your
I at least have sat in a lot of side events where I felt like I've just talked at more. So really appreciate your feedback.
Okay, so Chitra, I want you to think about something here, okay? Yeah. All right. We'll give you a little bit more time. All right.
It's actually to my earlier question. So you mentioned the example of Unilever. And so what Unilever did for palm oil is that they went from buying the certificates for their sustainable palm oil that they use in their own supply chain to actually investing on the ground, right? And so the reason they did that is that many companies are actually being criticized because they say, great, so you clean up your own supply chain, but that doesn't necessarily lead to a reduction of deforestation, i.e. An implementation of the deforestation goals under the NDC goals. Because, I mean, it's just one company, right? And there's so many other buyers of palm oil. So in the country, there can still be deforestation for other companies. And so I would say that this is probably a good example of how a company can actually take on the challenge and take the next step, and where more companies should move towards. However, it's also tricky because Unilever is such a big buyer, so they were investing actually a lot of money in these certificates, and by stopping that, they can probably invest a little less money, because right now what they're doing is just invest in one of these pilots. I think it's the one that you showed in Indonesia, in Kalimantan. So they invest now in this landscape, but in the end, they invest less money, or they compensate less their impact also on the environment, and they are kind of better off in a way, or it's kind of the cheaper version for them because it's pilot for now. So I think it's kind of something to observe in the future. Will they actually, once it's working, these jurisdictional or landscape approaches, will they really upscale their investment and at some point reach the same level of investment that they were investing previously through these book and claim, through these certificates for their sustainable palm oil?
Yeah, that's a great point. And as I understand it, I think their commitment is 100% sustainably certified palm oil by 2019. And that can be either mass balance or actual physical certified product. And you're sort of hinting at this distinction here, which is, they're trying to transition from kind of offsetting by buying certificates to actually driving sustainable production. And we may see it, I think the extent to which they'll achieve that shift by 2019, it probably remains to be seen, but I think it's an interesting trend to highlight.
Okay, sorry, yes, it's at the back.
Yeah, I can say something again since I was called upon. Just to clarify, me personally or Rainforest Foundation is not against public-private partnerships in any way. We think it should be public-private and genuine local stakeholder involvement partnerships, which I think some of these projects that you have studied are a good example of at least a progress towards. So we recognize that and we support it. It's we think it's an approach with a lot of potential. What I do think is important is that we make sure in these partnerships that since you raised this point of like de-risked capital, or like subsidized capital, we have to make sure that this that the requirements for the companies to actually access this capital are strong enough to actually ensure that it contributes to no deforestation, and that it isn't an investment in only a small part of the company's portfolio that isn't driving deforestation, and that they get a subsidized investment for that specific project, but it doesn't affect the entirety of their operation. So what you have all said now, and also said earlier about no deforestation commitments in the companies, I also think is really important. We cannot only look at the specific projects, but in terms of the companies accessing these kind of de-risk capital, has to look at the entirety of the company's operation to make sure that this is something that generally transform the way that they are operating. Otherwise, we will be using what is most likely also a big chunk of public funds to subsidize business as usual actions by the companies. So that is something that's really important to make sure that we avoid. Other than that, I think the approach is overall quite good. Yeah.
So I want to build off, because I think what you're getting at is maybe the NIC, the Norwegian government public-private fund that Unilever also contributed to, and that IDH is basically, I think, the secretariat. But one of the criteria, if I understand it correctly, that will be used for putting out the money to, like, for example, essentially Kalimantan or wherever Unilever is executing, is whether if they're meeting some kind of deforestation, to be defined, what is deforestation, but I think in the local context, is it actually achieving a level of reduced deforestation or zero deforestation at the jurisdictional level? And only then would it unlock the subsidized capital coming from the new NIC and IDH fund. Do I have that? And I think Rainforest Foundation Norway is working and helping define that definition. But I think that's an interesting example. And then hopefully we would see that also mentioned in the NDCs that are going to be reviewed here in the future. All right.
So I think that's sort of led into the last question, which is what recommendations do you have for companies, government, and civil society to enhance collaboration on corporate pledges and NDCs? Do we have, yes, we have.
Sorry, partly out of appreciation for your side event format. I'm Simone Lovier from the Global Forest Coalition, based in Paraguay. And I was a little bit hesitant to speak up because I was actually late, because I was in the other event on stakeholder engagement where we talked a lot about conflicts of interest. And it relates actually a little bit to the last two bullet points. Because I think there's indeed, in all these public-private collaborations, partnerships, there's a huge risk of conflicts of interest, of financial dependencies, of very subtle kind of incentives for the public institutions to align, public policy with the private interests. And of course, there's a lot of goodwill often, especially by the environmental officers that work for companies in these partnerships. But at the same time, at a certain moment, you will have to take quantitative measures. And what these people can talk about and what industries can talk about often is just restricted to qualitative measures. I mean, changing, improving production methods, but not reducing, limiting production. Because that is just not possible for a company to argue for under capitalist rules. A company needs to grow. Its stakeholders will insist that it will continue to grow. And if you then talk about zero deforestation, you have a huge dilemma, because in Paraguay, we've actually, and I don't know, apologies if people already talked about this, but we've actually seen very negative impacts of the zero deforestation bans policies in Brazil, because we saw a lot of cattle ranchers and soy farmers coming over the border. 75% of cattle ranching in Paraguay is in hands of Brazilians. And it's the biggest deforestation site in the world about the Chaco at the moment. And the hopeless thing is the only thing you can really restrict it. It's called, this impact is called leakage. And it's clearly recognized in all negotiations also that the only way you can really limit leakage is to limit production. And that is where you cannot collaborate with companies. So like also we've got this big GF project going on in Paraguay now in a dialogue with companies about zero deforestation. And what we just see is that they're shifting around soy production, they're shifting around cattle production, but they're not addressing the problem, which can only be addressed by reducing meat and dairy consumption in the end, including in, the importing countries. So I think that's a big dilemma. And if people have good ideas about that and have talked about it, I would be very interested to hear more about it.
No, thank you, Simon, and I would agree, and I think that's a very interesting kind of, again, at least the conflict of interest potential there is very strong, and the need, let's say, for a lot of transparency, probably in order to ensure that is not happening. Something that's been interesting, and I think we saw a lot of NDCs too, is the need for development and economic livelihoods, especially for, say, smallholders, rural populations, et cetera. And how do you balance that and intensification, production with, of course, I think, unsustainable demand, you might say, and pushing production from where, okay, we got better governance in Brazil, but then we just pushed all the deforestation to Paraguay, which then has less governance. So I think those are questions that need to be tackled. And I guess what's interesting is, I think what a lot of us say is we need to tackle them at a federal or national level as much as possible, as big a jurisdiction as possible, right? And how do we have companies engage at that level, and even maybe cross-border is another question. We've heard some NGOs, of course, talking about, I think, a soy moratorium across Latin America. And that's getting at the huge leakage issue, right? And normally leakage, we stop talking about leakage at whatever a country's border. Anyways, but thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a very interesting point we hadn't discussed yet. So, all right.
Do we have any other responses to the question? Or yes.
For the last question, I think before it's come to enhance cooperation, the knowledge dissemination and the awareness is very important, because the company may understand what the NDC, what the deforestation relating to greenhouse gas emission, that kind of thing the government have to address, and how to say enhance their knowledge and awareness and recognition the product that could be somehow not affect to the greenhouse gas emission as well. Mm-hmm. Not, yeah, and my point is just knowledge, awareness, to understand, and even for the not company, from the community, to keep, how to say, to get the pressure to the company to do whatever they should do, not in the previous time that to affect the deforestation.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really great point. And one of the interviews we conducted with the Earth Innovation Research Institute, which is facilitating this multi-stakeholder working group in Central Kalimantan, I asked them, what's one lesson you've learned through this collaboration? And obviously they have a bit of a vested interest in this response, but it still strikes me as somewhat compelling that they're playing a bridging role that is so often not filled, and it needs to be filled, right? This sharing of knowledge that you're talking about, where government's doing one thing and knows what it's doing, potentially, maybe not across levels. The private sector is doing what it's doing and knows what it's doing, but there's a need for organizations to kind of bring everyone together and help share those lessons, because I think it's often hard for the sectors themselves to play that role, but I think NGOs can play that role, and also bring in civil society and local communities and help to facilitate that process. That's a really important point.
Great. Well, thank you. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. We really appreciate all of your questions, and I think all the different levels that have been touched on. I think just something to end in the question about leakage is maybe that's an area where multinational companies that have a role, can have a role through having global policies, or they can span the different actions throughout governments. And I think there are some efforts to do that, like the Tropical Forest Alliance. But we're just going to finish with some wrap-up points from Chris, and then look forward to joining you outside.
Yeah, so I think the one thing that I would pull out of this a lot is, in building off of Suchitra's last point here, is right. We need to build capacity with civil society, communities, et cetera, and make sure that they're involved in these, consulted and involved in these different platforms or processes for consultations, even if it's more of a bilateral between private sector and governments, but they need to, again, be broader and ensure that consultations are happening. I heard also, again, the leakage issue, and I guess a lot of conversations around this jurisdictional approach. We also had some comments about definitions and what are we kind of talking about, but it sounds like, and of course, a little bit in each context and country, it's a little bit different, and that we probably need to take those definitions and maybe articulate those a little bit better in the NDCs. And I think those are probably the most relevant, again, I think, to our research questions. Again, and there was a lot of other observations and comments on some other aspects, specific programs, et cetera, but I guess I would say not necessarily as relevant to our research question. But thanks again, and maybe I'll just say, right, I think there are some beverages. You've all stayed, and we'll make sure you get first dibs at those. We appreciate your time and effort, and we, again, will be pushing this report out here, I think, next month. And please feel free, of course, to take advantage of the refreshments to ask Dana and Brian more questions about the research. Thanks a lot.